Hello and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Just a reminder that I've now set up an Instagram account for the podcasts, so please go and follow it if you're on Instagram. Just search The Hated and the Dead and you'll find me. Today's episode is about Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower had a truly remarkable life, serving as the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II and the 34th President of the United States between 1953 and 1961. Since this is a podcast about politics, today's conversation focuses on Eisenhower the President, rather than Eisenhower the military man. However, as you're about to find out, it's not entirely clear where one persona ends and the other begins. Eisenhower's unconventional route to the White House meant that he was hard to locate on traditional ideological maps, and he used this to his advantage brilliantly. However, whilst Eisenhower's political ambiguity helped deliver 2 landslide election victories, it also meant that he often abdicated political leadership on important issues. On no issue was this more obvious than how to accommodate the burgeoning civil rights movement, with Eisenhower's hesitation on confronting the issue of racial inequality during the 50s leading to the explosion of the civil rights movement in the 60s. In this sense, Eisenhower's presidency is perhaps a caution against choosing a leader that is, if anything, too moderate, especially if the country he or she governs is anything but. The America of the 1950s possessed just as many ideological stresses and strains as the America of today, and Eisenhower's attitude towards this, especially towards his own Republican colleagues, seems pretty tin-eared in hindsight. Despite this, Eisenhower often comes near the top of presidential rankings, having presided over strong economic growth, and few presidents were more popular as incumbents than him. My guest for this episode is Professor Julia Azari of Marquette University in Wisconsin. We discussed Eisenhower's ideology, his success in navigating America through the Cold War, his record on civil rights, and which of Eisenhower's successors has come closest to recreating his unique political appeal. The answer might surprise you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Dwight Eisenhower. Hi Julia, how are you?
Great, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. We're talking about Dwight Eisenhower today. He was the 34th President of the United States. I've never talked about a President of the United States on this podcast before. I originally contacted you about doing a podcast about Richard Nixon. This is a podcast primarily about controversial people, and Nixon's one of those people who's known primarily, I would say, for controversial reasons. Eisenhower, by contrast, is seen by many people as a figure of stability and of epitomising America at an economic and military peak in its history, the 1950s. Eisenhower's the person that you wanted to discuss. In a sort of, minute or so, why do you find him interesting?
Yeah, so there's 3 main reasons, which is probably the last thing you want an academic to say when you want them to talk for a minute. The first one is, I think of Eisenhower as both the first, in a lot of ways, the first modern president, but also a kind of archetype that in some ways we've been kind of looking for Eisenhower for the last 70 years or so. And the second thing has to do with kind of party politics and his role in the Republican Party and what's happened in the Republican Party after that. And the third one, I think, is where there is a controversy. It's just, at the moment, sort of confined to people who study mainly race in American politics, which is that Eisenhower's civil rights legacy is actually quite contested and debated and quite controversial among people who are interested in that topic.
Eisenhower was born in 1890. I think he was the last president born in the 19th century.
That's right, yep.
He was born in Texas, but his family moved to Kansas when he was a young child. What was his childhood like? What do you think, how do you think it informed his later life?
Yeah, I I always find this a challenging part of political biographies. I should say I didn't cover Eisenhower in either one, but I've taught 2 classes on political biographies, so I'm always kind of puzzling about this question. I mean, I think that it's hard to make that connection, and people often make that connection of, you grew up in this kind of big Midwestern strict family, and that informed his kind of worldview, in contrast maybe with people who grew up on the coast. But in a lot of ways, I think it's tough to make that call between the childhood and the political biography, particularly for someone like Eisenhower, who had such a kind of dramatic intervening event of his military service, which is maybe not our focus today, but obviously the thing I think that really shaped his political identity.
Sure. I mean, you've just mentioned the thing that took up nearly half his life, which was his military service. I mean, this is obviously mostly a podcast about politics rather than military history, so I'm only interested in his military career today insofar as it informs the type of politician that he ended up being. And there's no doubt that much of Eisenhower's appeal as a candidate for high office was down to the importance and achievements of Eisenhower as a military man. Can you give a very brief description of what that military achievement was and what he did during the Second World War and why it was important?
Right. Yeah. So he was a general, and at least one of his biographies has pointed to the fact that really his crowning accomplishment wasn't being an amazing general, but in taking command of the Allied forces and his role in World War II. So he was the sort of planner of the D-Day invasion of Normandy. And that's really the kind of crowning achievement and what made him a national figure. And so that's obviously, as you said, that was really the kind of catapulting of his political career. The other 2 things I would point to that sort of come up again and again in these Eisenhower biographies are, the first one is during the sort of World War I years, which is him being in a caravan across the United States, and realizing that the kind of national infrastructure wasn't very good. And then kind of deepening that realization as he spent time in Europe and saw, by contrast, what they had in Germany, and the advantages of having that kind of infrastructure. And that the kind of common wisdom among his biographers is that informed his approach to the highway bill, which was one of his kind of signature domestic achievements. The other thing that really comes out as you look at the way that he served as the commander of the Allied forces is all of a sudden you're really in a deeply political position of having to kind of understand all these different world leaders, the generals, also the heads of state, and kind of what kinds of military actions are not only going to be militarily feasible and achieve military goals, but also sort of work well for the different players involved. And so he had to get really informed about all these different people, not just in the United States and not just in his own division of the military, but in all these other contexts. And you really see that, I think, play out in his presidency as a Republican who's not only leading the sort of fractious party, but also leading in a time where the Democrats are still quite strong nationally and control Congress for most of his presidency. And so he's sort of, and they're also fractious. So he's got all this stuff going on domestically, all these different viewpoints. And that, I think, was informed by that military experience. But the third thing I do want to say about that I think often doesn't get as much attention as it should is that there are implications to having sort of cut your political teeth in a non-electoral context, and that's not a common background for a president. And it's a lot of it's a lot of political skill you build up in a big organization like the military. On the other hand, it's not the same as doing it in this sort of party politics election context. You don't get the same sort of background.
I certainly want to come on to that. I mean, the war and his role in it obviously made him incredibly famous, not just in America, but in the rest of the world as well. I think he got, in Britain, for example, he was presented with Order of Merits for certain cities which had been very heavily bombed during the Second World War as a sort of show of gratitude for what the Americans had done for the war effort in Europe. When did Eisenhower first consider going into politics?
So he was sort of people often use the word drafted, which I feel like is not a great word, but he was initially pursued in 1948 to run for president then, and he didn't do it. After serving in the military, he became president of Columbia University and sort of experienced, in addition to his military politics, experienced sort of academic politics and trying to lead and make decisions about kind of academic freedom in this early Cold War context. You actually get a lot of the same kinds of things that are going on here in the United States now, with these sort of questions about like what kinds of speakers to invite and how does this mesh with institutional values. And then in 1952, that's when he was sort of successfully courted by the Republican Party and declared that allegiance. Not trivia, I guess, but political background is that he wasn't a member of either party, and that it wasn't uncommon for a member of the military not to have that kind of political affiliation, and also it wasn't uncommon. The big thing is he had never voted. It's also not uncommon if you spent your entire adult life in the military and didn't really have a permanent address. Voting, political affiliation here in the United States is very much tied to your local residence. So that was when, in that 1952 election, when he joined the Republican Party as a potential candidate. And the politics behind that were essentially, you think about the Republican Party in 1952. They've been out of power, out of the White House, for 20 years. And that really shapes the way a party starts to think about what kinds of candidates it is going to recruit and how it is going to sort of sell those candidates to the public. So obviously Eisenhower was a very attractive target because he was so incredibly popular nationally, and they felt he could win. And again, I want to sort of flag this as one of the ways I think in American politics we keep looking for Eisenhower. We keep looking for the candidate who can sort of solve all these internal divisions and who can appeal across different social and political lines. And that it's clear that person existed in Eisenhower. The voting data, the public approval really speaks for itself there. It's not clear in contemporary American politics that we can have that. And it's also not clear as you look at the way Eisenhower's presidency unfolded, that's a logical gold standard outside of winning elections. But that's essentially what they're thinking about. If you think about the Republican Party at this moment, they had, I think, anticipated they might win in 1948. So you imagine a sort of shock level, kind of like the Democrats in 2016, except with 16 years prior of being out of power. So they're really thinking about, what can we do? And you have this moderate faction led by Thomas Dewey, who'd been the candidate in 1948, the subject of the famous headline, Dewey defeats Truman, that the papers printed, and jumping the gun a little bit. Had also been the candidate in 1944, an expected loss to FDR during World War II. And, sorry, go ahead.
No, please. I have a question, but I can wait.
So anyway, so this is a very deliberate courting of Eisenhower to become the spokesperson for what's considered at that time the kind of mainstream moderate faction of the Republican Party, which is very focused, not exclusively, but very focused in the Northeast, as opposed to a more Midwestern and border state sort of faction that is more conservative and would in the 1952 nomination contest be spearheaded by Ohio's Robert Taft, and that becomes a sort of famous showdown in a national nominating convention. But so that's kind of our setup in terms of how Eisenhower is drawn into politics. It's not just that he's drawn into one particular political party successfully, and the Democrats were unsuccessful in recruiting him, but that he's drawn in deliberately by a very specific faction within the Republican Party that is trying to position themselves and trying to make electoral gains.
But that's the reason that the Republicans wanted to go after him. As you said, in 1948, he had decided against running for office. In 1952, he does run for office. What had changed in Eisenhower's mind?
I don't think anybody knows. these are the other. I mean, as we get deeper into Eisenhower, we get deeper into this enigma and this sort of controversy among people who study Eisenhower about, why does he decide to enter politics? Is it he's persuaded? Dewey goes through and talks, other members of the military that know Eisenhower and things like that. Is it a sense of national obligation? Is it the same sort of service compulsion that drew him into the military, and this sort of sense about the ways in which in the late 40s and early 50s it seems like things can go wrong, right? And Eisenhower has this very internationalist view. He has a very well-developed sense of what the security threats are around the world, of the threat of communism, and that, if left to Harry Truman, who has gotten the country kind of mired in the Korean War, or left to someone like Robert Taft, who wants to draw back in and pursue a more isolationist path, can he save the country from these two kinds of leaders or perspectives that aren't going to be successful? I mean, he also kind of thought, in 1948, again, this sort of goes back to the prediction that the Republicans will win in 48. And so he's thinking, okay, if it's 1948 and one of the other Republicans wins, they're going to serve 2 terms, and then by the end he'll be too old, and then so Truman serves another term, and Eisenhower at that point is sort of like, okay, I'm at the right age to serve 2 terms, and that's, this is the way, these are sort of the options that the country is facing. In terms of why he picked which party he did, this gets at one of the other, I think, really hotly contested elements of the Eisenhower story, which is what really was his political ideology. He approached, like I said, he was attracted, he was drawn into the moderate faction, but, and his clearly was moderate relative to other types of political actors, and clearly in the way the Republican Party developed. But was he really a moderate? Was he a conservative with his sort of own read on conservatism? And this is, when I was writing my dissertation and subsequently my book on American presidency and the interpretation of elections, this was sort of the most pressing scholarly controversy about Eisenhower, and I believe since then it's really this one about race is heated up quite a bit more. But that is sort of the question here, is what was Eisenhower's ideology? I've kind of fallen in a place where I think Eisenhower had a governing philosophy but not a political philosophy. And I think that comes out of his somewhat non-traditional background. He had a sense of kind of what government should and also should not do, but had a less well-developed sense, again, from not coming out of a traditional political background, had a less developed sense of kind of who should be in power and how power should flow and how institutions should work.
He won the presidency in a landslide, and he became president in January 1953. I was sort of going to ask you about his political ideology, and I think what you've said about governing versus having a sort of well-formed idea of power and politics is sort of was my perception of him. Do you think he was interested at all in kind of changing things for the better, as many politicians claim to be, in a sort of deeply political or sociological way? Or do you think he basically just saw himself as a manager of a system?
Neither. Maybe. Here's, again, we're just like peeling back the layers of the Eisenhower enigma. When he was elected, and during the 52 election, he talked a lot about change and wrote a book, the 1952 Mandate for Change. And there was this whole idea behind his presidency of, okay, again, the Republicans have been out of power for 20 years, right? And so changing course from the New Deal and what they saw as the dangers of communism, the disaster in Korea, this is sort of the 1952 slogan, Korea, communism, and corruption. And this sort of corrupt party politics has really always been the hallmark of the traditional Democratic Party. At the same time, so Eisenhower comes in with his vision. He's going to change the way that the New Deal works. He's going to make the New Deal kind of more efficient, more rational, but not totally move away from the notion that the federal government has things it can do to provide for people. And, things like Social Security, things like the highways. This is going to be the kind of pursuit. So I don't think he saw himself as just a manager. I think he saw himself as a sort of caretaker of a particular kind of philosophy. But where this, and I don't know where you want to get into the race part, and I also have some things I want to say about the development of the Republican Party that go backwards a little bit into the 52 convention. Do you want to, let's go to the 52 convention and then we can talk about civil rights. So, to backtrack a little bit, Eisenhower's nomination is much more interesting in a lot of ways than the general election. In 1952, you're in this sort of hybrid moment. So some states hold primaries, but really the people who control the nomination are the kind of local party leaders. So you've got Eisenhower, who's, again, is a very popular, well-known figure. And then you've got Robert Taft. And what was very interesting to me, I've spent some time in Taft's papers in the Library of Congress. One thing that's super interesting to me about Taft as a figure in the Republican Party is that, so this is isolationist, very conservative, and he's getting all these telegrams and letters from people that really reminded me, as I was reading them in 2019, of the way Democrats were talking about Elizabeth Warren, of kind of, I love your ideas, I think you're really principled, I don't think you can win. And so Taft is getting those types of messages. He's also, though, notably, he's the insider candidate. He is the one who has a lot of kind of pull with these different state parties and with, importantly, as they go into the convention, the National Party and the Credentials Committee. So while Eisenhower's really popular, and he is like getting people to go to these Republican county and state nominating conventions who've never gone before, who aren't Republicans, who are independents or Democrats.
Which is a significant element that they weren't Republicans,
yes.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. Right. And so this is the whole story of Eisenhower. And it's the story of his military and personal fame. It is a story of his geography. This is where I think his sort of early biography matters, is not so much his what happened in his childhood, but the fact that he kind of has this Kansas vibe. This is very different than the Northeastern Republicans. And it makes him palatable to some of these former Democrats. And so that's the kind of dynamic of that nomination contest. And they go into the 1952 convention. There are several slates of electors that are contested, including Texas, which has got a lot of delegates. And there's this contest about, did Eisenhower... So the Taft people essentially accuse Eisenhower. They say Eisenhower people they're not real Republicans. They stacked these conventions. And they're trying to send an Eisenhower slate. And the real Republicans, the true party people who really care about this party, are the Taft people. And that is a dynamic around specifically the Texas convention, but also kind of going into the 52 convention. And Taft's strategy is, well, he's going to control the Credentials Committee, which is ultimately who decides which slates get to sit. So that's what Taft is going to do, and he has stacked that Credentials Committee. People think this stuff got made up in 2016 about how parties worked. It did not. But Eisenhower people are able to sort of circumvent this and essentially put the seating of the delegates to a floor vote, which they're able to really delegitimize this party strategy. Again, this goes back to American politics is in this weird hybrid place with the nomination, where it's like some primaries, not like it is now, but not quite like it was in the 19th century either. And so the Eisenhower people sort of accuse Taft, this is, several people who've written about this have referred to it as trying the Taft people in the court of public opinion. And that really looks bad when they do that. That really looks bad that the Credentials Committee is trying to control the process. And so they put it to a floor vote, and the Eisenhower people win. So that Credentials vote not only seats the delegations that put it over for Eisenhower, but it also sort of demonstrates their strength, right? It shows the Taft people that they've lost. And a few years ago, I spoke with former Senator Alan Simpson, who is kind of an old school Republican, and I think he was a very young person at this convention. I think he went with his dad. And he told me that the thing about this was the Taft people never got over it. They were mad. They were still mad. And it's not that Eisenhower didn't make any overture to them. You've got to unify that party. He picks anti-communist kind of, person with fairly serious conservative credentials, Richard Nixon, as his vice president, although he's always rather ambivalent about Nixon. So Eisenhower it's not that he wants to drum that faction out, although he's not interested in their isolationist ideas. But they're just mad about how this has gone down. And it sort of, I think, it solidifies two really important features of American politics. The first one is that it establishes this moderate faction as the dominant faction in the Republican Party, something that was not obvious leading up to that point. But their success in recruiting Eisenhower, their success in manipulating the ambiguities of the nomination process, and then their success in the 1952 general election, making it a kind of personality contest between the guy who won World War II and Adlai Stevenson. And that catapults the moderate faction of the Republican Party into the sort of establishment dominant position that was not clear that it held up to that point. And that really creates the space for what the conservative movement becomes. That means that the conservative movement in the Republican Party evolves in, not exclusively, but in really important ways in these non-elected spaces. It means that it evolves in the media. It evolves in the creation of the National Review in the 50s. And that who that movement is pushing back against is partly the Democrats, but it's also the Eisenhower administration, who they see as being too sympathetic to the Democrats and the New Deal. And that really, I mean, you can still, the role of the media and other kind of non-elected spaces as the seat of the conservative movement, that is one of the, I think, most important features of American politics today. And it really, I think, reverberates out of this politics of the 1950s and out of this sort of sense of marginalization of conservative Republicans.
That's really interesting. I think you're absolutely right in the sense that it's still a change which is carried over to today. Perhaps, I want to talk about Eisenhower as president a little more directly. I know you want to talk. There are things that you want to talk about. We'll get to them, but. Yeah. I remember reading once that Truman, a few days before he left office, is rumoured to have said that he thought Eisenhower wouldn't like being president because it wasn't like being in the army, and he couldn't just click his fingers and get things done. Did Eisenhower like being president?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think yeah. Actually, I think yes, and maybe. Folks who have studied his sort of personality and biography more closely would dispute that, but I've never seen any evidence to suggest that he didn't like being president. One of the things that a sort of recent piece, more it's not recent anymore, but it's sort of intervention in the scholarly trajectory of Eisenhower is Fred Greenstein's work, The Hidden Hand Presidency, where he essentially, this is, the Eisenhower Papers open up, and he learns, Eisenhower has this whole way of organizing the White House and interacting with his various advisors, and, including Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, including Chief of Staff Sherman Adams, all of these different people that he's interacting with that are, he's able to kind of make, not make them do things they don't want to do necessarily, but sort of set up political situations so that they're the face of difficult and unpopular decisions. And at the same time, he's able to take credit for things that are good and able to be really ambiguous in a way that maintains this large coalition. And he ran for re-election in 1956, which I think is usually an indicator. If he hadn't liked being president, he could easily have exited the stage at that point. He was not a political animal. He was not Bill Clinton. And also things came up that he didn't necessarily want to deal with, like race and civil rights. I think he did enjoy being president, had his particular way of doing it that worked for him. And I think, was really invested in re-envisioning the country's approach to international politics. And this is some of what I mean by being the first modern president, is that he's really got to skirt, the Cold War means you have to skirt this line between war and peace.
In terms of the international stage, the Cold War context is obviously incredibly important to his presidency. The Korean War was still going on when he became president in 1953. Mao Zedong's communists had taken over China in 1949. The presidency is primarily, at least in the confines of the Constitution an international position. It's a position to do with foreign policy. Do you think he was overall a successful international president?
That's a really complicated question, because I think it forces us to really identify our vantage point. This is where, I think most people would say yes. Certainly, I think in the presidential scholar world, people would say yes, right? That he did what he said he was going to do in terms of getting the United States out of the Korean War. That his sort of management of the Cold War, nothing terrible and nothing dramatic happened. I think there are a couple ways that we could think about things that weren't as successful. One is the sort of, setting the country on the path to Vietnam, which is that's a whole other podcast you could do, but clearly not resolving those issues and kind of paving the way again for things that would really manifest themselves in the 60s and 70s and to some extent still today. I also think that this is another area where there's been sort of this new wave of scholarship. There's this really good book, The Brothers, about John Foster Dulles and the other Dulles, Arthur, I think, and the CIA, which goes through all of these covert operations. And this is where I think, my perspective is maybe a little bit different than some other presidency scholars you might talk to, because I'm also an Iranian American, and so I've sort of grown up in the shadow of stories about the CIA and Mossadegh and the kind of overturning of the only democratic government that Iran ever had, which my family were supporters of. And that's, I think, when you read those books, and if you really have a kind of internationalist perspective and you want to think about this from the perspective of different people throughout the world, the things that the Eisenhower administration signed off on are very different. I mean, on the other hand, we don't have a counterfactual, right? We don't know what would have happened had communism spread the way some people were worried that it would have. What would have happened had the United States dealt with the Soviet Union differently in the 50s. I don't have the answer to those counterfactuals, but I do have a sort of perspective that I can't really get away from about the international repercussions of some of those decisions. I guess the final thing I'll say, right before we recorded, I listened to his farewell address again, and that's, everybody kind of talks about that in the military-industrial complex. And I think that one of the advantages that Eisenhower had as someone who came from outside of politics.
Sorry, can you just explain to people what Eisenhower said that was significant during that speech, just for people who don't know?
Yeah, I mean, he warned against the development of a military-industrial complex, and of kind of excessive expenditure on the military and excessive focus that way. And he talked a lot about, dollars spent on the military can't be spent on feeding children and on other sort of more pressing domestic human needs. But I think what's really interesting about that is that, as much as I think Eisenhower had some disadvantages coming from outside electoral politics, that the advantage of that is that I think he could see very clearly the ways in which political incentives create an alternative to policy incentives. And that there, on the one hand, you look at, what the international policy needs, right? What American foreign policy needs. And on the other hand, you have the sort of political pressures of a military-industrial complex, right? You have industry that sees that there's money to be made. And you develop a sort of a set of business imperatives, a set of domestic political imperatives that are really not aligned with the imperatives of foreign policy. And that can sort of take on a life of its own. I think that, as this is mostly speculation, I don't have any hard evidence for this, but I think that as someone who came from outside of politics, that Eisenhower maybe saw that more clearly or with fresher eyes.
When I asked you about Eisenhower over email, and you mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast again, civil rights was one of the reasons you mentioned as to why you find Eisenhower interesting. How did Eisenhower interact with the early civil rights movement, and did he attempt to kind of accommodate it?
This is one of the, I think, key pieces of that story, is he doesn't really sit down with civil rights leaders until 1958. So quite late in his presidency. This is another area where Eisenhower is an enigma, where on the one hand there's historical record that suggests he's quite egalitarian in his mindset, and the military was, in a lot of ways, was sort of at the forefront of integration at that point in time. And at the same time, there are, particularly as the main issue during his presidency becomes school integration. There is one quote about him sort of saying he didn't blame people for not wanting their daughters sitting in classrooms with African American boys. He doesn't say that, but it's not a crude statement, but it's a pretty objectionable statement, and also is, I think, pretty pretty well exemplifies the crux of that controversy. I taught this last semester in a class called The President in History, and one of the things that was interesting about that, I think for a lot of my students, they hadn't thought about race as having gone back this far, which was sort of hilarious. But there's something about the Eisenhower chapter that really changed their thinking. But one of the questions I asked them was sort of like, when do you think we solved this school integration problem? And nobody really knew. And I said, I don't think we have. So 1954, the Supreme Court rules on Brown versus Board of Education, and unanimously strikes down the idea that separate schools can be equal. So that's all well and good. And Eisenhower, importantly, had appointed Justice Earl Warren. That's one of the things people point to when they talk about the strength of Eisenhower's civil rights record, is the appointment of Earl Warren. Is not opposed to this decision, and very specifically says the important thing here is it's the court's job to interpret the Constitution. So once Brown v. Board is decided, Eisenhower becomes very kind of institutionally cautious about what's in charge of what. And the court has the power to interpret the Constitution. And Eisenhower sort of says, when the court says it, that's the law of the land. Okay. So that's all well and good. Then the question becomes, how do we implement that? And like I said, that question dogged Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and I think as of today, we still have no idea how to put that principle into practice. By some measures, our schools are actually more segregated than they were then. So Eisenhower kind of privately grumbles about, why did the court have to decide this while I'm president? This was not what he wanted to deal with. And so there's a sort of procedural argument. He said this really is for localities to figure out. And he also, throughout the 50s, sort of made this argument of, what needs to happen is people need to give the South patience. People need to understand that the South is going to, take a long time to deal with this major change in their way of life. And the more we sort of push, the more the South will get alienated and rebel. Which, there's a lot of ways you could evaluate that, but factually it's sort of true that it's not obvious the South could have been accommodated, but in reality they did respond. There was very strong response to the Brown v. Board decision. There's the Southern Manifesto that they won't integrate. There's, through the 50s, a sort of growing violence in the South. And you have the 1955 murder of Emmett Till. This becomes a kind of focal galvanizing point for the civil rights movement. You have, again, kind of mounting violence against civil rights leaders, and there's a bomb planted where Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be. And, Eisenhower is, I think, increasingly just sort of, it's not obvious what the president's role is there. And here, once again, we see the presidency itself at this sort of modern crossroads. Eisenhower is president at a time where there's TV, at a time when FDR had really made a point of using the radio, addressing the country on pressing moral issues. And Eisenhower, when it comes to race, doesn't seem to want to do it. doesn't want to make a speech. His successor, Kennedy, eventually makes a speech talking about the morality of civil rights. Eisenhower is a supporter and ultimately signs the 1957 Civil Rights Bill, which is pretty bare bones because of the role of Southern senators, but it did establish some federal infrastructure for civil rights. But it's just kind of like, okay, the president has this capacity to be a national moral leader. Is it going to be, is Eisenhower going to marshal the power of the office to do that? And civil rights leaders are, make no mistake about it, are asking him to do that. And it's not clear, did he not do it because he thought it would be counterproductive? Or did he not do it because he didn't want to spend his political capital that way? Nobody knows.
I mean, one of those interpretations is a lot more charitable than the other, clearly. I mean, I suppose, forgive me for trying to kind of put words in your mouth, but I think what you're saying is that his quite non-radical stance on these issues condemned a lot of African Americans to white racist people who controlled whichever local area they were unfortunate enough to live in. Yeah, is that more or less what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean I think that is the story of American history, and that is, the extent to which Eisenhower stands out in this is, only because of this context, and maybe in some ways is remarkable again because of the partisan context, which is, you have the Republican Party is kind of the party of Lincoln. Has, to the extent there are enfranchised African Americans in the North, are Republicans. That starts to fall apart with Herbert Hoover. That starts to fall apart, and African Americans are, although FDR is not a spokesperson for civil rights, is not a spokesperson for anti-lynching, the economic benefits of the New Deal did extend to African Americans, even though they were also excluded from some of the programs. So that becomes a shift in sort of party loyalty. But, there's just this long history of particularly black leaders sort of saying, neither party is really forefronting our needs, is really putting themselves out there for us, is really, doing what needs to be done as far as a federal anti-lynching bill. Most recently, the United States Senate declined to pass anti-lynching legislation in 2020. It has never been passed.
I want to move on to talk about the Republican Party.
Yeah.
Under Eisenhower. You've said that he was politically ambiguous. Mm-hmm. Distinctly so for a president, really. Then, as now, the Republican Party had a kind of hard conservative wing. Mm-hmm. It was anti-New Deal, viciously anti-communist. Again, the Cold War context is important. You have the McCarthy trials, trying to root out communism from American society. How much dissent? You mentioned the sort of the Taft Republicans in the early on. As his presidency progresses and as it comes to an end in 1961, the Democrats take over the presidency again. John F. Kennedy wins. He beats Vice President Richard Nixon in a very close race. What happened to the Republican Party after Eisenhower left?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? That is the driving question of American politics. So, I think your point about, this is a very close election, 1960, but Kennedy wins. The Democrats had took back control of Congress in the midterms in 1954 and held on to it until the 80s in the Senate and 94 for the House. So what happens to the Republican Party in the 60s? They have at this point multiple different factions and different ways of thinking about what it means to be a Republican. And you still have a strong kind of liberal wing of the Republican Party that believes in, I guess if I were going to caricature their beliefs, right, they are drawing from these 19th century notions that sort of vision of national strength, right? It's business, but it's also that the government provides things like education, infrastructure, that makes the nation strong, and that makes business strong. And that's a sort of going vision of Republican philosophy. You have a sense, of course, that especially after 1952, when Eisenhower does this successfully, that there are votes that can be picked off as the Democratic Party becomes the party of civil rights. Something that doesn't definitively happen until 1964, but is sort of there, that tension is really there with Kennedy and the Democrats. So you have this sort of building conservative movement that has also multiple facets, right? This sort of anti-New Deal, anti-government expansion, and that philosophy is really sort of fertile ground for opposition to civil rights. And then later it becomes weirdly this sort of locus for a kind of populist pushback against this more sort of cultural turn, and that's more of a phenomenon of the early 60s and the 70s, and then as onward. So I think that that's essentially what happens to the Republican Party, right? That they nominate Barry Goldwater in 1964. That's what happens. But Barry Goldwater is also very complicated turning point there, because Goldwater, I don't think, would be particularly legible to cultural conservatives today.
Before I go examine
off the Goldwater tangent.
No, I was just going to say, before we examine him, Goldwater, in retrospect, do you mind talking a bit about what Goldwater's politics was like at the time, how it differed to Eisenhower's?
Yeah, so I think, in many, many ways, because it was a politics that's very sort of heavily symbolic, and very much rooted in opposition to the expansion of government, opposition to the expansion of civil rights. And Goldwater held to the idea that it wasn't that he opposed racial equality, it's that he opposed the growth of the federal government. And that turned out to be not a particularly winning strategy. This became really divisive within the Republican Party. One of their most kinds of divisive conventions ever. In 1964, a lot of high-level defections and voter defections, and so ultimately the only states that Goldwater wins are his home state in Arizona and then states in the South. And that's really different from Eisenhower's very measured approach to foreign policy, approach to everything. Someone who did see a role for the state and the federal government, even though when sort of push came to shove with civil rights, that became really complicated. But he was, again, as I said, sort of a supporter of some civil rights federal legislation, provided it was passed through these sort of institutionally proper channels. Goldwater had a little bit of this sort of symbolic and bombastic style that we would associate with conservative Republican politics today, even though he lacked the sort of cultural edge that it gained in the 70s and 80s.
Clearly, the Republican Party took a sharp turn to the right between 60 and 64, or at least at its leadership. Just to ask you one last question then, do you think that the sort of rightward turn that they took, do you think it was a reaction to Eisenhower's personal style and politics, or do you think it was a manifestation of other changes that had gone on in American society and in the world? Sorry to keep harking back to it, but obviously the importance of the Cold War, anti-communism, those things.
I'm not sure what the precise Cold War story would be here, because I think in a lot of ways the Cold War, as it pertained to kind of domestic electoral politics, got sort of like, would get used in various strategic ways that I don't know are necessarily reflective of some of those developments. And that includes Vietnam, which very quickly became sort of integrated with these cultural disputes. I think that some of what you see is that Eisenhower, like other presidents leading up to that point, Democrats and Republicans, sort of tried to hold the kind of racial compromises together around ideas of sort of balances with localism, and trying to get maybe non-electoral institutions like the court to take care of different things and limit his role. And then when that was impossible in the mid 60s, Johnson, really I should start with Kennedy, right? Kennedy speaks on civil rights, Johnson finishes that work legislatively, and then Nixon can't ignore it. That's, I think, the major catalyst in American politics. But I do think that what's important for the development of conservatism is the way that it sort of was able to develop in the margins and in the silences of the 1950s. And that this sort of merging of the Eisenhower personality, the outsider, the person who can appeal to Republicans and Democrats and independents, and that merging that with whatever was going on with a moderate mainstream Republican, and this sort of notion of Eisenhower tries to make the party into the modern Republican Party, which is not regarded as a great success. But it's the dominant strain through the 50s. And it's that lack, right? It's that silence that allows this movement to start and to build up some of its sort of key infrastructure, including conservative media. It's there when these other issues start to evolve. And it's there when you have this sort of insertion of populism and cultural questions in the 60s and 70s, as you get the Vietnam protests, the sexual revolution, the kind of liberal court decisions on things like prayer in schools, right? As the culture starts to shift, this conservative infrastructure already exists and already has a sort of sense of itself as being marginalized and out of the mainstream. And that's really where I think, the key element of the Eisenhower presidency is not so much his personal reaction to that turn toward, he was toward the end of his life by that point, but it's really kind of what happens in the shadow sounds very dramatic, but out of power.
No, I understand what you mean, and I think that if you were to go forward to the sort of last 10 or 15 years, the Tea Party movement, I think, in some ways evolved in a very similar way. It evolved online. It evolved when Obama was in office, but it also was a reaction against the kind of Bush era. Yep. Of Republican politics. No, that's really interesting. I will let you go in a second. There's one last question I'd like to ask you. You said at the start that in some ways America has been looking for an Eisenhower figure as president ever since he left. I don't think anybody has found the same level of universal appeal. I could be wrong, but who do you think has come closest? If you had to name one of the 11 or 12 people that have assumed office since, who is it?
Donald Trump. I always meant to write this piece, and it's going to piss everybody off. And it's not because I don't think Donald Trump. So we should qualify this. This is a different thing. Donald Trump is not universally loved. That's obvious. He never won a majority. He was not especially popular, but he was incredibly well known, and I think that was really the key to his success. And as I always meant to write this piece during the Trump years, and it wasn't that I was afraid of pissing people off. It's just I just never got around to it. Kind of comparing these two, because this is the most obvious comparison point to having someone who really is coming from a very different kind of background into the presidency, and someone who is an outsider to the party, but then the party sort of attaches themselves to for strategic reasons. But I think that it tells us a lot about contemporary fame. So, I mean, on the one hand, like, we haven't had World War II, right? That is a big difference. People talk about Colin Powell. That's what everyone expects you to say. But, like, the big thing with Colin Powell was he was in one of the two parties. He didn't want to run for office, and he didn't. And it's also not clear that actually someone, this particular figure that he was, would have been especially successful in a Republican primary. Maybe in 92 or 96, but certainly not after that.
Because he was too moderate.
Yeah. And, I mean, because he was black. right? Like maybe a black candidate could succeed in a Republican primary, but we don't have a lot of evidence to suggest that that's that's likely. So you have, and that was when his wife didn't want him to run because she thought that was dangerous. But so with Trump, you see like what is national celebrity in this era? I'm 42 and I've never not known who Donald Trump was. Everybody knew his name, and that's a huge advantage. It's a huge advantage in a primary.
It's why he won the primary, really.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's one of the as someone who did all the same things that was just some rando would never have won, and it helped him in the general as well. And then also being famous in another venue, as Eisenhower won and as Trump was, allows you to really maximize your ambiguity. And I think ambiguity is an underappreciated part of presidential politics, of winning the nomination. You have to prove yourself, sort of like you have to suggest you could appeal to multiple factions within a party. You also have to at least get enough people outside your party to vote for you to win. And, that's something that, we're still debating about. Was Eisenhower a conservative? Was he a moderate? What were his real racial views? And with Trump, and I don't think there's a lot of question about his racial views, but he was ambiguous on key questions in 2016. And I think that in the general, in particular, that there's evidence that shows people thought he was more moderate than Hillary Clinton. And that people saw him as, he's a businessman, and he's a name that they know, and, he'll just govern, he'll govern in the center, and he'll be practical, and he'll fix the economy, and he'll do all these things. I think a lot of people thought of that, and they thought of him as, Trump, the successful businessman that people perceived him to be, and not necessarily if you were, following the rallies closely and things like that. So honestly, that's the comparison. That's the blog post I never wrote.
Trump wasn't the last person on my sort of mental list of who you were going to say. I thought if you were going to say anyone, you'd have probably said Ronald Reagan. Just simply because he also came from outside of politics, and I think at least for a while seemed to perhaps transcend Republican Democratic politics. I'm not 100% sure if that's true now I think about it more deeply, but...
So here's the Reagan difference. Bringing up Ronald Reagan, maybe not the thing to do if you want to get me off the phone, but...
Yeah, that's fine.
The Reagan difference, I think, is that a lot of what catapulted his success in the general election was just sort of like the disaster of the end of the Carter presidency and Carter's unpopularity. I think that was the feature that really worked for him. Not so much ambiguity, not so much his ideological identity, and not even really his fame as an actor. But the other big difference there is that he's been governor of a very large state.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was great. I really enjoyed that. Where can people find your work if they want to find out more about this or other things that you've written?
Lots of places. I write for a blog called Mischiefs of Faction. We are an independent political science blog, mischiefsoffaction.com. I'm a regular contributor at 538. I podcast weekly-ish on a podcast called Politics in Question. I'm the author of a book called Delivering the People's Message. I am probably on Twitter tweeting some dumb crap about my cats. That's where you can find me.
Julia, thank you. Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.